Hi, everyone, and welcome to the College of Health's colloquium series in population health. We're really excited this whole year, this academic year, to focus on disability independence, which is a strategic research initiative in the College of Health. We're also thrilled to be joined this time around with some co-sponsors of the series, including the College of Arts and Sciences interdisciplinary programs, perhaps most notably the Health Medicine Society program, and our clinical partner, the Good Shepherd Rehabilitation Hospital. So we're thrilled that you've joined us. We have a great turnout. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ed Gomez, who will tell you a little bit more about the series.
Thank you, Dean Dolan, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today and taking time from your busy schedules. The Population Health Colloquium series started in the summer of 2020, the beginning of when our college started. And the focus of this monthly series will feature activists and scholars across disciplines who advance the well-being and agency of people with disabilities. This Disability Independence series celebrates the College of Health Strategic Research Cluster of the same name, as well as the College of Arts and Sciences interdisciplinary approach to social problems. These Zoom presentations are open to the public and will be published on our Colloquium series YouTube website. The Colloquium is sponsored by Good Shepherd Rehabilitation. I'll be happy to address, I'll be conducting the questions and at the end of the presentation by Dr. Smilges today. And I'll turn it now over to our colleague to introduce our speaker.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lorenzo Cerviche. I'm an associate professor in the Health Medicine Society program and the Department of English in the College of Arts and Sciences. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. J. Logan Smilges. Led by commitments to transfeminism and disability justice, J. Logan Smilges, they, them, writes and teaches at the nexus of queer and trans disability studies, the history of medicine, and rhetorical studies. They're an assistant professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at the University of British Columbia and author of Queer Silence, On Disability and Rhetorical Absence, 2022, and Crypt Negativity, 2023. Their work has appeared in a number of journals and edited collections, including Transgender Studies Quarterly, Disability Studies Quarterly, College Composition and Communication, and the Routledge Handbook of Queer Rhetoric. Currently, they are working on both their first novel and third academic monograph about disability, affect, and metaphysics. Please welcome Professor Smilges. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. I'm hoping that my screen is sharing correctly. And if not, I hope that someone will find a way to let me know. I am so very grateful to be here today, and I appreciate all of you for making time for me, especially midweek in the middle of the semester. I want to offer many, many thanks to, first, Lorenzo for inviting me to be here, and thank you for introducing me. I want to thank the Population Health Colloquium series for really making this event possible, and of course to Sherry for handling so many of the logistics behind the scenes. You know, it's always a real treat to enter into conversation with folks who are already familiar and invested with interdisciplinary work. It makes my job a lot easier and more enjoyable when I don't have to spend people's time justifying interdisciplinarity as a valuable mode of scholarly inquiry. So thank you all for being you. Before I dive into my remarks, I do want to take just a moment to invite everyone in this virtual space to occupy this space in a way that is as comfortable and accessible to you as possible. Now, comfort for you might mean something like drawing, knitting, rocking, ticking, stimming, or anything else while we talk. Access might include standing up, lying down, taking laps around your kitchen, or taking breaks. You might choose to keep your camera on or off. You might need to leave the Zoom for a while and then come back, and I hope we'll be able to let you back in. And you might just decide to leave early, and that's all right too. We all have different bodies and different minds, and I really want to encourage you to honor your own body, mind, and all of its exquisite variations. I also want to acknowledge that comfort and access are not available to everyone in the same way or to the same degree. It is the case, for instance, that I'm zooming in from Musqueam ancestral lands, meaning that the place that I'm in will always carry with it legacies of violence that render it perpetually inaccessible for many Musqueam and other indigenous peoples. It's also the case that as Palestinian people in Gaza continue to undergo a genocide, that this particular moment is not one that can or perhaps should be comfortable for any of us. And I cite these examples both to enrich our understanding of access with some material specificity, and also to offer an entry point into today's conversation about bad feelings. And there we go. I want to make sure I'm on the right slide. Okay. So when Lorenzo first explained to me that the theme of this speaker series is disability independence, I distinctly remember laughing, or I remember him laughing at the face that I made. Now, I've never had a particularly strong poker face, so I'll be honest with you all that hearing the words disability and independence in a sentence together made my eye twitch a little bit. Now, to be clear, I don't have any problems with the words disability or independence on their own. As a disabled person in the field of disability studies who studies accessibility and is committed to disability justice, I firmly believe that disabled people are entitled to the privacy, agency, and opportunities that the language of independence is typically used to describe. And I'm aware too of how unhelpful and at times violent it can be to characterize disabled people as uniformly dependent. Now, that said, the reason my eye twitches a little bit when I hear disability and independence brought together is that when independence is touted as a singular and self-evidential goal for disabled people, we collectively miss out on the opportunity to ask how disability might transform the values of our society, including the value of independence. And so what I'd like to offer today is an invitation to think expansively about how the embodied and in-minded reality of being disabled can precipitate alternative modes of being together. And these are alternative modes that don't fit within the rubrics of dependence or independence, but instead gesture toward new socialities and forms of belonging. And I offer this invitation with the recognition that each of us has a different relationship to disability, and that regardless of your own personal disability status, we all can share in the belief that the disabled body-mind is a valuable site of knowledge and knowledge production. And I'm having a little trouble getting my slides to change. There we go. Thank you all for your patience. To offer some context for how I'm coming into this conversation, I want to just briefly sketch out my recent book, Crypt Negativity, which I wrote as an extended meditation on the bad feelings that many disabled, debilitated, and otherwise non-normatively embody-minded folks accrue in a world structured by ableism. Now, for me, ableism is a broad term, far wider than most people give it credit. The field of disability studies and the wider terrain of disability activism often frame ableism as a collection of access problems. If a person cannot enter a room because there is no ramp, or if they can't participate in a conversation because there's no sign language interpreter, or if they can't understand a contract because it's too full of jargon, then that room, conversation, and contract are inaccessible for those people. Inaccessibility occurs when disabled people and our needs are intentionally dismissed or accidentally overlooked. Either way, ableism is at work, barring disabled people from participation or what we might call independence. But as almost every disabled person will tell you, ableism casts a wider net than the language of access is able to capture. And I'll give you an example of this. When I was in high school, and on the screen you can see a picture of little old me back in high school, my nickname was Awkward John. And I earned it because my name at the time was John, and I was very awkward. I walked far too fast and carried a backpack too full. I sat so straight at my desk that my back never touched the chair. I demanded to be in the front row of every classroom in a seat that faced the door. I reminded teachers about homework. I attempted to spark impromptu political debates with classmates between sets of push-ups at lunch. I asked out girls who usually turned me down, and I held the hands of those poor few who agreed so tightly that our fingers would cramp. I was a theater kid, but I could not act, sing, or dance. I lifted weights with the football players, but I'd cover my ears and I would run from the weight room if the volume of the stereo was turned too loud. And once, when a couple of boys were shooting spitballs at me during study hall, I slammed a textbook on their table. And I said, "The next time you hit me," and of course I'm like gulping back tears, "the next time you hit me, I'll ruin you." And then I immediately went to the bathroom and cried. So when I think back on my time in high school, I'm flooded with memories of my own misunderstandings, of missed cues, of moments when I knew I was being made fun of or outright mocked, even as I pretended that I was unaware. There were so many times I could recognize my difference from the shape of others' faces. So many times I could feel their eyes glossing my awkwardness. Now, it's certainly true that some of the bullying I experienced was run of the mill, kids being kids. And sometimes kids, much like adults, are just mean for no reason. But it's also true that there was something more structural at play. After all, there's always a reason that some kids get bullied over others. Some differences seem to matter more, and the differential mattering of those differences matters. The disability studies scholar in me calls the differential mattering of my difference ableism, as a way to capture the disciplining of my in-minded departure from neurotypicality. The virality of my nickname, Awkward John, read against my otherwise invisibility, suggests that much of the bullying I encountered was less a result of random injury than an effect of people's shared anxiety over my neurodivergence. My awkwardness needed to be policed because if left unchecked, it risked exposing the fragility of normativity more broadly. If my own queerness and disabilities were not suitably stigmatized, if I were not reminded daily of my social failures, it would become far more difficult to justify the more intense forms of discrimination and segregation faced by other students, such as disabled students restricted to special ed classrooms, or poor and racialized students who, because of redlining and gerrymandering, were literally bused to other schools. In a lot of ways, Awkward John had very little to do with me, and far more to do with shoring up the boundaries of white cis hetero-abledness against the threat of differences perceived far greater than mine. If I could be sufficiently abjected, so too could others. And this returns us to the definition of ableism. Nothing about my education was inaccessible. I could get into the building and to all of my classes. I could understand the lessons and complete the assignments. I had teachers who offered a variety of formal and informal accommodations to help me fulfill course objectives. And yet, despite all of this access, ableism still managed to make my life absolutely miserable. If anything, I wanted less access, less contact with non-disabled people, less time spent in spaces structured by neurotypicality, and less energy expended accommodating me into a community that exploited my neurodivergence as an opportunity to ossify its superiority. In my case, access, or the pursuit of independence, did not eliminate ableism. Instead, they enabled ableism to bear its teeth. Now, my book, Crip Negativity, builds on this observation to address how too concerted a focus on individuals' access needs or independence distracts from the messier, meaner, and more systemic ways that ableism operates in our world. Now, disability justice activist Mia Mingus writes that, quote, access for the sake of access is not necessarily liberatory, end quote. And I'll add that independence for the sake of independence is not necessarily liberatory either. In fact, sometimes access and independence do little more than reinforce the status quo. For example, in the American public education system, the benchmark for accessibility is what's known as LRE, or the least restrictive environment. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act requires that, quote, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled, end quote. In an attempt to maximize students' independence and minimize segregation, LRE stipulates that as much as possible, disabled students should use the same classrooms, teachers, and curricula as their non-disabled peers. In this case, access and independence are synonymous with integration. The more thoroughly that disabled students are integrated into the world of non-disabled people, the more appropriate their education must be, or so IDEA assumes. But this version of accommodation, what I call integrative access, fails to account for how ability operates as a structural norm, informing the ableist cultures into which disabled students are expected to integrate. My experience in high school was deeply shaped by ableism, even though I had all the access and independence I needed for a successful integration. My education was appropriate in accordance with the law, but the conditions under which my education took place made it nearly unbearable. Moreover, the independence extended to me via integration worked to further legitimize the disenfranchisement of other disabled and differently marginalized students. Now, I share all of this about my past with you to explain why I'm left wondering about the political utility of access and independence in the context of disability justice. This is to ask, does the language of dependence name the violence we think it does? And does the energy we spend demanding access secure the kind of liberation we want it to? Now, there's no question that we are living in a world plagued by access problems, wherein disabled, poor, old, racialized, colonized, trans and gender nonconforming, and queer people are frequently left without the basic essentials they need to survive, let alone the equity that they need to flourish. It remains the case, for example, that many poor and racialized children with and without disabilities are denied access to a complete education. Statistically, students of color are both more likely than their white peers to be diagnosed with disabilities and less likely than their white peers to receive special education services. I don't intend to downplay the classed and raced realities of inaccessibility in the US education system, or to cast doubt on the urgency with which we should all be working toward greater access to better education for all. What I'm really after is not the availability of access, but rather the outcome of it. What are we hoping access will do for us? What is the benefit of securing access to an education that purposefully misrepresents our country's legacy of settler colonialism and slavery? Whom does it serve to demand access to an education that only includes cis heterosex within its sexual health curriculum? How is life improved for disabled students if access to an education means suffering the brutality of having their disabilities exploited to protect the integrity of their abled peers' own insecurities? And similar questions could be asked about the utility of access in other domains of life outside of education. In terms of labor, for instance, what is the value of access to employment when disabled people are one of the only adult populations in the United States who can legally be paid less than minimum wage? When earning minimum wage is not enough to clear the poverty line, or when the working conditions at a job are so deplorable that they exacerbate existing disabilities or produce new ones. Regarding healthcare, how can we celebrate access to a medical industry that is built on knowledge gleaned from non-consensual violence against enslaved Black women, that profits off people's dependence on insulin to survive, and that enforces sex dimorphism on children born with intersex conditions? Or in what way do we even make sense of increased efforts to enhance the accessibility of prisons when we know that the prison industrial complex presents one of the greatest threats to many marginalized communities, especially people of color and disabled people? In all of these examples, access might offer a form of inclusion, perhaps even a necessary form, but it is an inclusion bereft of history, as well as the ways this history continues to shape our material present. As Smilges explains, access that can be reduced to integration does nothing to transform the conditions that created inaccessibility in the first place. These are conditions that structure the very institutions and systems into which we have been demanding access. Institutions and systems such as public education, the workforce, the field of medicine, and the law were not merely made to serve abled people best. They were built on the explicit disavowal of disability. Indeed, it was the same humanist project that emerged during the Enlightenment era that at once celebrated the autonomy of man, insisting on the value of independence, and exalted rationality, what we might understand as mental fitness or able-mindedness, as an essential qualifier for man's freedom from political oppression. To call for access to or independence within a society predicated on disabled people's exclusion is to forget that even if we get them to let us in, and us here refers to the collective of disabled, debilitated, and non-normatively embody-minded folks, if we get them to let us in, we cannot make them want us here. And even if they say they want us here now, how do we trust them after all this time? And these are the questions that lead me not only to be suspicious of independence as a God term within disability advocacy, but also to be hungry for models of sociality that emerge from within disability community. Without dismissing the value of independence entirely, if we can so much as acknowledge that independence is a form of integration, then it behooves us to look elsewhere for forms of belonging and ways of being together that are rooted in the range of experiences that we call disability. And what I'd like to offer for the remainder of my time today is a glimpse into one such way of being together that models what a non-integrative crip sociality might entail. Now, to do this, I want to turn to, of all things, a Netflix show that some of you may be familiar with called Special. It's a semi-autobiographical comedy starring Ryan O'Connell, a gay white man with cerebral palsy. One of the first season's central plot lines follows Ryan as he tries to lose his virginity. Like many disabled people, Ryan finds it difficult to navigate sexual relationships, especially in the gay community where ableness is among the bastions of desirability. At the suggestion of a friend, Ryan chooses to hire a sex worker to be his first sexual partner. Played by Brian Jordan Alvarez, in the smaller picture on the screen, I believe. Actually, yes, in the smaller picture there. This played by Brian Jordan Alvarez, the sex worker Shay expertly guides Ryan through his first time. The audience watches Ryan's initial nervousness fade away as Shay does what he was hired to do, offering Ryan access to sexual knowledge and pleasure that he was struggling to find elsewhere. And I'd like to suggest a reading of this scene that proposes erotic labor as a site for what I call access thievery. This is the crip sociality that I want to dial in on. Access thievery as stealing the access we need to flourish, and as an opportunity for critical solidarity between anti-ableist and anti-capitalist movements. What I find exciting about a sex scene between a gay disabled person and a sex worker is not necessarily its potential to normalize sex for disabled people, but its potential to align twinned queernesses, that of gay sex with a disabled person and that of erotic labor. Both are aberrant practices within the context of a society that idealizes monogamous, hetero-abled love as the most esteemed form of intimacy. More importantly, their appearance together highlights the solidarity that access thievery can generate. In the scene, Ryan is not stealing sex from Shay. He's purchasing it through an extra-legal crip economy that runs counter to the forms of capitalism that structure heteronormativity. What's being stolen is not the sex itself, but access to sex, which Shay offers as a paid labor. Despite institutional and cultural prohibitions against disabled people having sex, Ryan smuggles it for himself with Shay's assistance. Likewise, we can imagine Shay's erotic labor as itself a form of access thievery that forages economic survival while refusing conventional waged work. Femi Babylon, an erotic laborer and cultural critic, has argued that there is something deeply liberating about channeling erotic labor into an anti-work agenda. Attempting to normalize erotic labor by calling it work is, for her, a kind of half-assed reform. Proposing erotic labor as an example of access thievery is to lean into its anti-capitalist potential, what Vanessa Carlyle has described as a politics of self-worth and community care. In Shay's case, the theft occurring, in Shay's case, the theft occurring is not interpersonal. He's not stealing from Ryan, just as Ryan is not stealing from him, but structural. Shay is stealing a livelihood from an economy in which the forms of labor that constitute legally sanctioned work are narrowly defined and heavily surveilled. Together, Shay and Ryan are building a counter economy through access thievery, one in which mutual care acts as a currency for collective survival. Now, in the show, we're not told very much about Shay. He only appears in one scene as a light-skinned, muscular man. And there is no reason to assume that he, like Ryan, is disabled, and he might not even actually be gay. However, it's worth acknowledging that many sex workers are disabled or otherwise marginalized and choose to pursue erotic labor because it offers varying degrees of access that are unavailable through conventional employment. Zia Moon, a sex worker with a chronic illness, has written at length about how well-suited erotic labor is to her own and other disabled people's needs. She says certain sick folks must navigate a gray area. What do you do if you're too sick to hold down a full-time job, yet not sick enough for disability benefits? And a typical part-time job isn't enough to survive on, especially with medical bills. End quote. We can also hear from Haley Jade, who's a neurodivergent sex worker who agrees with Zia Moon, suggesting that erotic labor is the perfect job for someone with ADHD and autism because there's a routine, but there's also variety in their clients and how they spend time together. Jade mentions elsewhere that she appreciates being able to work specifically with disabled clients, noting that they're both contributing so much to each other's lives. In their case, erotic labor is a rare opportunity to steal access for themselves and remain in community with other disabled people by offering a service that many of us need. Access thievery is how she takes and how she gives. Jade's experience resonates with the scene from Special insofar as they both capture access thievery's bilateral movement. Between sex workers and their disabled clients, access thievery works in two directions, applying to the clients who secure intimacy outside the strictures of institutionalized heteronormative monogamy, and to the workers who push back against their exploitation under capitalism. Both figures steal access for themselves and for each other. Their thefts accumulate or interanimate as mutual resistance to sexual ableism and ableist capitalism. What Ryan steals is simultaneously invested into Shay's flourishing, and what Shay forages is redistributed as Ryan's access. This is stealing the access we need to thrive ourselves, so we might be better equipped to aid and abet others' criminalized modes of indulging joy and manifesting pleasure. This is theft that enables more theft, access doubling up on itself, multiplying. It's pilfering a little time, a little energy, a little money, or a little affection in order to reinvest these same resources into others who need them. And this is where I'll end today, with a vision of non-integrative access, with a model of interdependence that eschews both the stigma of dependence and the false promise of independence. Access thievery is all of the ways we do bad things in order to honor ourselves as whole people. Sometimes we need to be reminded that we are whole people worth honoring. Sometimes I need help replenishing my spirit so I can honor your whole person because you too are a whole person worth honoring. Now, while I wish we did not have to steal our flourishing, having to steal it does not make it any less ours. We might be in bad health. We might have bad feelings and we might be bad people. But what a damn shame it would be if we settled for a bad life. Thank you so much for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Smilges. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I would like to now open it up to any questions from the audience. If you have a question, please use the Q&A button on your bottom screen. click on that and put your question in there. I do see that we have one question from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, would you consider the large population of neurodivergent and asexual people who participate in BDSM a form of access thievery?
Sure. Sure. I think, you know, with a question like that, I'm not, I'm not in the business of wanting to police how people make use of a term. So let's say that an asexual, aromantic, just ace, neurodivergent person finds the language of access thievery useful to explain their relationship to BDSM practices. If that's the case, more power to them. I think I could see a really persuasive argument in the sense of BDSM being something that society typically kind of conscripts or restricts for folks who are, kind of fitting within normative sexual expectations around like compulsory sexuality, compulsory sexual attraction. And so if an ace person finds their own way into that community, I think that's really exciting, and we can absolutely call it a theft.
Great, thank you. The next question is, what do you think are the first steps to reforming the way our society thinks of access and inclusion?
Well, I think there are two first steps. There are a lot of steps, but the two come to mind. First is to kind of consciousness raise among the public that there are access problems, that there are a lot of people who do not have access, who remain unincluded. And I suggest this as a first step because despite perhaps what all of us in this room already know and believe, there are a lot of folks who are under the assumption that equality has been achieved. Equity is here now. So I think there's a lot of education that still needs to take place. And then the second step, and I think this is one perhaps more tailored to those who already align themselves with the left or with progressive politics. The second step involves identifying how access and inclusion are ultimately failed strategies for a full liberation. Because often the discourses surrounding those terms fail to really grapple with the ways in which large institutions with state mechanisms are designed to exclude. So it does not matter who you seek to provide access to, who you choose to include, there will always be populations brushed to the side because that is how modernity operates. And so I think on the one hand, we need to acknowledge the ways in which these current systems are failing people, and then also be able to push beyond mere access or inclusion into those systems in order for us to allow ourselves to dream of something bigger.
Great, thank you so much. The next question that I have here is, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Are there any possibilities for access thievery within higher education that you see or might recommend? Thinking about how neurodivergent scholars might work within the inaccessible world of academia.
Yeah. Yeah, yes. So I can think of a few examples. One example is something that I indulge in from time to time, which is when rather than securing accommodations through something like a disability services office, which disabled people are either already know or quick to learn, are not typically very helpful places. Rather than securing accommodations through those offices, we can instead find other ways of providing ourselves access. I have been known from time to time to call out of meetings, not show up, cancel a class, because of my disabilities, because I cannot make it. The problem is that by trying to secure an accommodation through Disability Services Office, there's generally an expectation that whatever accommodation they give you is going to realign you with the kind of performance metrics of all of your non-disabled colleagues. And this is not how disability operates, right? Sometimes disability is actually disabling in the sense that you need to work less, not just work different. And so sometimes we need to steal that, right? And by steal, I mean we just don't show up. We just don't do it. Now, I write this, or I say this with the understanding that the capacity to not show up is stratified. Not everyone has the same amount of access to that access thievery. The costs are different. The risks are different. If you are a contingent faculty member, if you are a graduate student, if you are a staff member, the risks for not showing up are often higher than they are for someone on the tenure track, right? So the risks are stratified. And this is one of the reasons that in Crypt Negativity, in my book, I talk about the fact that access thievery, while sometimes useful as an independent strategy, is most effective when it's navigated in community. And it's why it's so important for disabled people everywhere, but including higher education, to build networks with other disabled folks so that when you need to steal access, you can do it among others who can help protect you, right? Because if there's one thing that institutions don't like, it's being stolen from, right? That's why it's a criminalized mode of being in the world. And so by aligning yourself, building critical solidarity with other disabled folks or with just other folks who feel themselves marginalized by the same institutions, we can not only engage the kind of theft practices that make our lives a little bit more livable, but also kind of produce these safeguards. We can have people who will be able to cover our class at the last minute, people who can help make up excuses in the meeting that we skipped, right? These ways of being there for each other. Sometimes we just call it friends, right? A friend's gonna be there for me. And sometimes they're not friends. They're just folks who understand the struggle and who are willing to have your back when you don't have the energy to look out after your own.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Our next question is from Lorenzo here at Lehigh. And his question is, how might we attend to about assistive technologies with health skepticism and attend to the promise and realities of assistive technologies with healthy skepticism without immediate reactionary rejection?
Well, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I'm going to approach it from a faculty perspective, because I often think there is a hesitation, a caution, a skepticism among a lot of faculty about the use of assistive technologies in the classroom. So I think that's where this question is going, or intended, but if not, Lorenzo, please follow up. I think there is a lot of fear among educators broadly, not even just in higher education. I think we can look to the K-12 world as well. There's a lot of fear among educators that assistive technologies are preventing students from actually learning and often serve as a form of cheating. And we can see this across both technologies designed for disabled students, as well as technologies just available to the public. For disabled students specifically, I'm thinking of students who need to use computers in class. students who need additional time on exams, students who need to take exams in a different room, students who have designated note takers, right? We consider these, we can think of these as pedagogical technologies, right? Because they're meant to alter a student's learning. But then there are also, of course, technologies that are increasingly available to the public that we hear talked about on the news every other week, related to AI, right? ChatGPT. How are students using technology in the classroom? And a lot of this fear comes from, I think, two things. One, that faculty don't understand the technologies. And whenever humans don't understand something, we can be a little bit afraid of it. But then second, what we do understand is that they are fundamentally changing how students are engaging with their learning, fundamentally changing it. And this is especially the case in the case of AI, right? If students are no longer composing in the way that they have traditionally since composing was invented, that produces a lot of fear because it puts pressure on the pedagogies we use to teach composing. And I don't want to make a claim that fear is completely unjustified. I don't know yet. I haven't spent enough time thinking about it. But one thing I do know is that fear alone is generally not a sufficient amount of evidence to do away with the technology completely. And I think that one alternative way of approaching these, what we might call assistive technologies, is thinking about what populations will now be able to access education in a way they were not previously able to access it. And second, in what ways will these technologies not only reshape education, but also reshape the industries into which students are likely going to be entering after their education? And I think there are so many ways that we can begin answering those questions, but those are the two that I think weigh on me the heaviest. My biggest fear, to be honest, is not that students are using these technologies. That's just not something that concerns me. Rather, my fear is the way in which these technologies will very quickly be co-opted by capitalist machinery in order to demand labor that students perhaps previously were not expected to produce. And we're already seeing that take place in the world of AI, where one, we have underpaid laborers across the global South who are responsible for maintaining AI databases, often at great cost to their own mental and physical health. And we also see the ways in which AI is beginning to change students' preparedness to write to write in their jobs if they don't already have an AI program kind of designed to facilitate that kind of composition. So those are the things that I'm thinking about. I'm not sure if you would agree that that's healthy skepticism, but it's where my mind is at.
No, these are wonderful questions and comments, because I think we're all struggling with AI and sort of how to address this issue, both within the university and outside of it. So thank you for that. That was fantastic. One other question that we have is from an anonymous attendee is, as a teacher, how do you work with disabled students to maximize their access and to make that access actually helpful?
Well, it's such an important question. First and foremost, I treat access as a conversation. And I like to use the metaphor of a conversation for a couple of reasons. One, because it imbues the student themselves with the agency to articulate their own needs. To say, this is what I need from you in order to be able to access the material. Sometimes those needs are fully met by the accommodations that student has already secured through something like a disability services office. Often, however, those accommodations are insufficient. A student needs more. And so by treating access as a conversation, a literal conversation as well as a figurative one, talking with the student saying, what can I do to make this course accessible to you, immediately transforms the dynamic, because now access is not an obligation that you are required to provide, but is rather a culture that you are nourishing within your classroom. Second, I like the metaphor of a conversation because it ensures that access is ongoing and leaves room for its dynamic change. Our bodies shift constantly, which means our needs shift constantly. And unfortunately, access, as it's typically conceived in the university, in the world of the university, is static. A student is guaranteed this accommodation that will either last that year or perhaps even for their entire time as a student. That's not how bodies work. Sometimes a student needs a different kind of access during week 1 than they need during week 5, than they need during week 12. Sometimes their access is different in class than it is during exams. Sometimes their access is different depending on whether their course is in the morning or at night. Access needs are contingent, they're dynamic, they're fluid. And so by treating it as a conversation, you're allowing room for students to say, this is how I need you personally, as this specific instructor at this time during this moment in the semester, to help me engage. And then third, I like to speak broadly with students, not just my disabled students, but broadly with students in my courses about access as something we can all benefit from, regardless of our explicit relationship with disability. By doing this, by having this conversation with all students, and I do this in front of the class, usually for the first few weeks of each term, by talking with all students about what access is, how we can articulate it, what it means to say, this is my need. This is what I need from you. By having those conversations, we are nourishing that culture of access that refuses an individualized model, right? It is not the disabled student with a problem. Rather, we are collectively addressing that this is a classroom, this is a space in which we value everyone's participation, and we will collectively work to ensure that everyone is able to engage how they are most comfortable doing so. So that is how I like to address it. And I'll offer the one caveat that there is no such thing as perfect access. It does not exist. I think, unfortunately, the language of universal design has given people the false promise that there is some world in which everyone can access everything perfectly. That doesn't exist. Not only because there will always be access needs that we won't predict, but also because our bodies are so fluid, right? Access needs are always changing. So rather than taking on the anxiety of having to predict everyone's access needs, we should treat it as a conversation. What do you need from me in this moment? I'm going to do my best to offer it to you under the conditions of my own access needs as an instructor, because you're allowed to have access needs too, right? We're in conversation, and that's the best we can do.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is from Professor Binoy Nambudiri in our own College of Health, who is also working on disability research. And his question is, I understand your thoughts on putting the words disability and independence together, and the advocacy for the term interdependence instead. Wondering what you think of the words disability and inclusion together, such as quote unquote disability inclusion is another common framing.
Thank you for the question. I tend to group the language of inclusion, inclusivity, along with a lot of other kind of liberal terms surrounding oppression, We might group inclusion with diversity, with access, with equity, increasingly justice. Unfortunately, that term is being co-opted as well. I'm currently on I'm currently on a committee in my department. It's essentially our equity committee, right? And the title of it is Anti-Racism, Equity, Diversity, and Accessibility, right? And similar to what I said at the beginning of my talk, I don't have any problem with these words on their own. I think they can, and they certainly have historically done really important work. But I'm a rhetorical scholar in the sense that, I was trained in rhetoric, and so I'm really attentive to the ways in which language changes over time. And much in the same ways that language can shape the world too, so too can the world reshape language. And so what we're seeing over the last decade or so is the increasing co-optation of terms related to oppression, including, I think, unfortunately, the word inclusion. The co-optation of these words away from their initial intention to call out problems within institutions, to instead serve the institution by shifting the location of the critique. It was originally the case that the critique was the institution, right? This institution has an issue with inclusivity, right? And that issue is not simply that the university doesn't include enough people, it doesn't include the right people, but rather that it was designed to exclude people. That was how the term was originally used. But increasingly, it's being used as this kind of superficial invitation to get more bodies onto campus, right? If we can have more disabled people on campus, then like we've solved ableism. And that's not how that works, right? One, because identity does not equal politics, right? You can have lots of disabled people who unfortunately have zero interest in disability justice, who are perfectly fine living in an institution structured by ableism. But second, you can also, you can get as many marginalized people onto campus as you want. And that does not mean that the experience they're having on campus is one we might define as inclusive or just or equitable, right? And this is why I think there are really important conversations to be had about the gap between recruitment and retention, right? What happens when you have a decent number of students of color enrolling first year and almost all of them have left by the time they graduate, right? That's saying something about the culture, something about the institution at its core, that increasingly the language of inclusion is not capturing like we think we initially wanted it to.
Great. Thank you very much. Our next question is, do you think a diagnosis is key to accepting yourself as a disabled person? Or do you think that the medicalization of disability as a whole is moot?
Oh, well, I certainly will always reaffirm my commitment to self-diagnosis, especially among folks for whom diagnosis is inaccessible. There are so many disabled folks for whom receiving a diagnosis or interacting with medical personnel is simply undesirable or impossible, right? Partly because, as folks know, in the US, it's expensive, right? Receiving a diagnosis can be incredibly expensive, cost prohibitive. I'm also thinking, though, of the number of people for whom interacting with medical personnel is dangerous, right? If you are a Black person in the United States, seeking out a diagnosis is an invitation for medical violence. And it's understandable that you would want to avoid that. And so yes, I will always reaffirm my commitment to self-diagnosis as a valuable way of seeking out community membership with other disabled people. I perhaps, I'm not the second part of the question, whether medicalization is moot, I'm not sure what's necessarily intended by that phrasing. I think I might ask for clarification on it. I do think that the conventional authority structure between clinicians and patients is not good. I think the way in which many clinicians presume knowledge and authority over their patients' experience of their own bodies is a real problem for medical education today. At the same time, I think it is the case as well that we are seeing an unprecedented amount of misinformation about the body and the mind circulating on social media. And I think there is some cause for concern that and it's not a cause for concern for self-diagnosis, that's not my concern, but rather there is a trend among, I think it's fair to say mostly young people online to see self-diagnosis as not only a means for community membership, but as a means of just understanding oneself in the world. And while I will always support a person's decision to identify how they want, I do think there's an important opportunity lost when we uncritically accept a diagnosis, regardless of whether it's given to us or self-chosen. If we uncritically accept a diagnosis without interrogating the symptomology, interrogating the conditions under which that diagnosis was originally developed. And there are lots of reasons why I think we should be suspicious of that, all related a lot to kind of globalization and race and class. But I do think that's something to watch. So I understand that's a bit of a qualified answer, but yes, I support self-diagnosis. Also, what are we self-diagnosing ourselves with?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thank you. The next question is, how do you reconcile the gap between access thievery as a concept and access to it specifically in the context of race and economic status?
Do you mind repeating that question? I'm not sure I fully understood it.
How do you reconcile the gap between access thievery as a concept and access to it specifically in the context of race and economic status?
Yes. So I think that two things. One, access thievery is something that is already being engaged by almost every disenfranchised community that exists, because access thievery at its core is survival. How do we survive in spite of institutions refusing to offer us the access or the resources that we need to survive? And so it is absolutely the case that racialized and impoverished communities are already indulging access thievery. One example that I offer in the book is taken from Lawrence Ralph's book Renegade Dreams, where he talks about he's a Black disabled gang scholar, Lawrence Ralph, and he writes about the practice of trade in injury among Chicago's gang communities. And trade in injury is essentially when debility or targeted disablement is traded across rival gangs, effectively creating large numbers of disabled people within certain Black communities, or at least gang affiliated communities in Chicago. And as a result of this debilitation, which we can absolutely understand ultimately as an effect of state divestment and like kind of institutional failure, as a result of this kind of mass debilitation, there have been care collectives developed among those communities that offer access to one another. And that access, which I understand as access thievery, involves things like sharing wheelchairs and sharing prosthetics and sharing canes and sharing the kinds of material resources that typically are allocated to someone through their healthcare provider, but healthcare is not available to a lot of these folks. And so access thievery becomes a way of caring for one another, right? Stealing access. But a second thing that I would really want to emphasize is that access thievery, while I think it's something I want to honor and amplify and perhaps celebrate as a mode of survival, is ultimately something I don't think we should be like wanting in the long term. Ideally, the conditions would not be that people would have to steal their access, right? Ideally, we would have states that support people, right? Or we would have a lack of states. We would have a world in which people would collectively be able to thrive and receive what they need in order to thrive beyond just mere survival. And so I think when we talk about the gap between particular race and class communities and access thievery, we have to address the real historical materialist problem at the core of access thievery, which is that it exists in the first place, right? So while I do think it's valuable to identify these practices as incredible models for solidarity and care in, you know, a world of austerity, we can also mourn the fact that they're needed in the first place. So I hope that gets at your question. I'm still not sure I fully understood it, but you're welcome to ask a follow-up.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is from another anonymous attendee, and their question is, how do you better advocate for yourself when seeking treatment for disabilities like chronic pain, which are usually dismissed as being dramatic?
Oh, goodness. So this really depends on who you are, right? It is the case, for example, that when I present myself in a clinical space, while I am sometimes, I sometimes face problems because of my medical history, because of my psychiatric history, that affects my, what I would call my rhetoric ability or my ability to be trusted. My agency is sometimes constricted. It's also the case that I'm a white person who often appears gender normative. And because of my education background, I am able to speak a language among clinicians that often demands a kind of compliance. And that is something we can we call medical privilege, right? So whenever we talk about self-advocacy in the world of medicine, we have to begin with, well, what are the specific conditions under which you are advocating yourself? What body are you occupying? And if a person is entering a clinical space read femininely, like read as a woman, if you are read as a person of color, if you are read as someone with an intellectual disability, the kinds of self-advocacy that you are even allowed are going to be mitigated by those factors. And I think it's one of the reasons it's so important for a lot of folks to have someone else in the room with them. Don't go to the doctor by yourself. Don't, because you're not going to be safe and you're not going to be listened to. You know, a number of times this morning already, I've talked about the value of care collectives, right? Access thievery is one thing by yourself. It's another thing when you do it with a group. And I think this also applies to self-advocacy, even with something specific to chronic illness or chronic pain. If you can have someone else in the room with you to not only demand that you are listened to, but to confirm for the presenting clinician that your symptoms are real, your pain is real, they have seen it, right? It doesn't even matter if they're lying. Maybe this is just, you know, this is someone that you only know at work, but they're willing to come and just confirm, right? You have to play the system And this is, similar to what I was just saying with the last question. These are strategies we need to develop that I wish we didn't need to develop. But we're living in this kind of liminal moment where even as we work toward a world in which these kinds of problems did not exist, they do exist right now. And one way I think of addressing it in this moment is showing up in masses. And so yes, when you go to the doctors, bring a friend.
Very good point. Thank you. Yes, the next question is from anonymous attendee. Thank you for such a great talk. My question is, you seem to use words like theft, steal, etc. very purposefully, as opposed to words with less of a traditional negative connotation like take or procure. Why is this?
Yes, you're correct that I am intentional about this. And the intention is to really highlight the ways that in which disability and disabled people have historically been aligned with moral failure. And we know this based on historical narratives surrounding predecessors to the category of disability. Prior to disability, we had a moral model of bodily difference in which many of the people we would now call disabled were referred to as monstrous, right? And this legacy of monstrosity continues to affect a lot of the connotations surrounding disability, especially mental disability, in which disabled people are not trusted, right? Yeah, as an autistic person, I cannot tell you the number of times where I have been in long relationships with people who do not trust me, right? They assume that I'm lying, that I'm not fully transparent, that I'm hiding something. And, these assumptions are shaped by a culture in which disability is associated with not only moral failure, but what we can increasingly recognize as a kind of criminalization. And I think it's also important to kind of read a racial analysis into this as well, given the ways that over the last century and a half or so, that race has been read through the language of disability in order to justify certain forms of white supremacy. When populations of color, particularly Black people, have been like criminalized in the past, and I use the past somewhat in air quotes. The justification for such criminalization has often been because of the alleged shiftlessness of Black people, and that shiftlessness we might understand as a form of pathology, right? So the language of disability has long been used not only to indicate a kind of bodily incapacity, but also like a moral one. So yes, thank you for identifying the intentionality behind the language.
Great, thank you so much. And we have one final question. I think that will be it for today. And that is, what policy directive will you recommend to the government to minimize access thievery?
I don't mean any disrespect to the question asker, but I'm not quite sure I understand. Simply because I'm not in the business of making policy recommendations. I'm deeply suspicious of policy change as a liberatory tool, and I'm not seeking to minimize access thievery. I think it's something that we need to encourage among as many populations as possible, and not even encourage because I think it's already taking place. But I think we need to celebrate in the sense that it's helping keep people alive. So while it is true, I wish we lived in a world wherein access thievery was not necessary. We currently live in a world where it is necessary. And so I want to really honor the genius of folks who are learning to live in a world that's inhospitable to them.
Right. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Smilges. That was fantastic. And I very much enjoyed your presentation today. I learned so much from everything that you mentioned and talked about. Such an important topic, and really loved your perspective, which is so unique on this topic. And I just want to thank you and thank all of our attendees, Dean Dolan and all of our staff at the College of Health. This talk will be published on our YouTube series for the colloquium, for our colloquium here at Lehigh. And I wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. And thank you again, Dr. Smilges, for taking the time today. And thank you all for attending. And I hope that the rest of you have a good day and take care of yourselves. Oh, please join us for our next speakers, our next presentation on March 26th on Tuesday. Dr. Arpana Nair, Assistant Professor, Department for Health and Society, Center for Global Disabilities at the University of Toronto, will be joining us for our next Population Health Colloquium discussion on disability independence. So please mark your calendars and join us for that event as well. Thank you, everyone, and take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.